Good morning and welcome, and sorry for those technical difficulties we just had. Welcome to my home and thank you for welcoming me to yours. And special shout out to a number of friends and family I have joining us today from their retirement village in Victoria. In the spirit of reconciliation, the Property Council of Australia acknowledges the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea and community. We pay our respects to their elders past and present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples today. We've got over 270 people from around the country joining us today for this presentation on the Code of Conduct, and I thank you all very much for taking time out of your day to come and join us to hear more about the Code and what it means for your retirement community. This is a live event, and unlike many other video conferences you might have been a part of, I can't see you, and that means you're not going to be able to speak directly to me or raise your hand, but there is an opportunity to ask questions and to submit those for us to respond to in a question and answer session after each of the presenters has spoken. Importantly, today we're not going to be able to talk about specific complaints that you might have regarding your retirement village, or indeed any specific complaint you might want to raise in the context of the Code of Conduct. You can follow up if you do have a complaint and email the Code Administrator at complaints@rlccode.com.au. That complaint needs to be in writing, but it does not need to be lengthy, and the Code Administrator will work with you to ensure that any issue that you raise is dealt with appropriately. My name is Ben Myers. I am the Executive Director of Retirement Living for the Property Council of Australia, and I'm very proud that the members of our Retirement Living Council and the members of Leading Age Services Australia worked together to develop the Code of Conduct to ensure that there was a consistent and clear set of standards for the operation of retirement communities around the country. The Code commenced operation in January this year, and already 42% of retirement village residents in the country live in a Code registered village. The Code is about making sure that we as the industry deliver on our commitments to residents and to ensure that your choice to live in a retirement community is well and truly seen by everyone in our community as a wise move. I'm very pleased to introduce our first speaker today, Megan Hobson, who is the Code Administrator. Megan joined the Code earlier this year following an extensive career working at all levels of government, where she liaised with constituents and government departments to understand legislative requirements while managing personal expectations. Megan, over to you.
Thanks, Ben. I'm really excited to be here and presenting again today, especially to this unique opportunity of residents, although I do know we have a lot of operators, village managers and staff joining us from around the country. So to have 270 people listening in is indeed overwhelming. And just a reminder, it is being recorded and will be sent out next week in case you want to listen to it again. So as Ben mentioned, my background is in government. I've worked at many different roles in that arena and worked in Canberra and Brisbane for members of parliament and ministers. So I have extensive knowledge and experience in assisting people manoeuvring and working with government departments and certain industries. So I bring that to the role. And I also, on a personal level, bring my own experience in my parents recently moving into a retirement community. So I definitely understand all the decisions that need to be made, finances, property type, management, facilities, and I think most importantly, reputation. And I think it's the reputation that has led to the development of the Code of Conduct, because the operators realised there was a need for a set of standards across the board. And now, whilst this code was developed with the assistance of operators, industry leaders, residents associations and the Ethics Centre, it is important to note it is a voluntary code of conduct. We ideally would like governments around Australia to see how valuable it is as a resource for them, and perhaps become mandated one day soon in the not too distant future, because many of you may be listening in from a retirement community that is not code compliant and is not interested in becoming code compliant. So that is something that we'd like to see across the board to ensure your well-being whilst living in and moving into living in and leaving a community. My position, as the title suggests, is as the administrator, and I register all of the applications for operators and get them their resources, work with them to ensure they are code compliant, they continue to be code compliant. And until this point, I had not had to speak to anyone about any complaints, but that is, as we progress with information sessions such as these, we're finding more people are becoming aware of the code, which again was why it was so important for us to be able to speak directly to residents. And I would like to acknowledge the help of the resident associations around the country in getting this far and wide and ensuring so many people are able to join us today. The Code of Conduct also includes a breach and sanctions. Now, I won't go into all of those breaches and sanctions today, but I wanted to point out that there is a breach matrix in the Code of Conduct booklet, and that is available on the A Wise Move website, or alternatively ask your operator. If they are code compliant, they will have a copy of the code, and you can look at that and see how that might help you in any concerns that you have. And further to Ben's statistics on 42% of you living in a code compliant village, there are today 69 operators code compliant, which equates to 557 villages and 66,167 independent living units are covered by the code in Australia today. That's so encouraging, but we know we can definitely do better. And that's what, when you hear from Elizabeth, her and I and the code review panel are trying to do in getting the information out there that it does exist and it is here to help you. And that is my role. I am an advocate for you as the resident in working together to make sure your well-being and health and safety is paramount. As I was preparing my presentation, I had no complaints. This week, and I believe it's as a result of our ongoing promotion of the code, I have received 2 formal complaints. So I'm really excited to get into those and try and assist where I can. And they are both from code compliant villages. So I look forward to working with the code compliance officer in the village and getting these resolved quickly, as we don't need people going to the media or spending time waiting and waiting. Come to me, let me help you, let me get it resolved as soon as possible, and hopefully avoid any lengthy legal experiences. So that's it from me today. I really thank you for your time and look forward to working with you. And here's hoping that you don't have any problems, but if you do, you feel free to reach out to me, and we'll continue to put up the email address, and there will be a slide at the end for more information on the website. So thank you, Ben.
Thank you, Megan. And I've never been in show business, but I do know that they say never work with children or animals. And while I'm lucky enough to live in Queensland and my children are at school, I apologise if you see my dog running around in the background and jumping up and down and barking. She's a little excited about this event, as I'm sure we all are today. Our next presenter is Dr. Elizabeth Lanyon. Elizabeth is the independent chair of the Code Review Panel and comes into that role with 40 years experience in Victoria. She is currently Company Secretary of Good Shepherd Australia New Zealand. Prior to this, Elizabeth was a senior Victorian Government executive with policy responsibility for retirement village regulation and consumer protection. Elizabeth is currently Deputy Chair of a community aged care facility and brings a great deal of experience and expertise to her role in ensuring that the code is run properly, that it's run fairly, and that there is a really transparent process behind managing complaints and ensuring fairness for all parties involved. Over to you, Elizabeth.
Thank you, and thanks to everyone for having me in your place today. And I'm obviously at my place in deep lockdown in COVID-bound Victoria. I was incredibly excited to see the retirement village industry take a step up with the development of the code. It's an incredibly important step in giving you as residents increased confidence and knowing that your concerns will be addressed. And it also, as Megan alluded, doesn't only cover residents living in retirement villages, but covers the processes of moving in and something that's often very fraught, which is moving out. So it is an end-to-end set of principles, and it basically is the code that is framed around principles and values and a set of obligations that an operator who signs up to the code agrees to. One of the great features of the code is that it is a first step in really getting third-party oversight of the all aspects of retirement living. So as Megan said, there is a code compliance officer, and then Megan is our code administrator. So another aspect of that third-party oversight is the fact that there is an independent panel, independent that is both of the operators, but independent of the Property Council, independent of leading aged services. An independent panel, which I head as independent chair, which has as part of the panel a kind of doyen of retirement villages operators, Peter Nilsson from the Village Glen, but also Alistair, Christie, a very esteemed representative of residents, whom you're going to hear from in a minute. And that means that we can have an independent look at any code breaches. If Megan can't sort them out, we as an independent panel can get involved and also deal with breaches. So that's a really important oversighting role there. One of the key parts of the code is really underpinning many of the principles and values is transparency and openness and accountability. And we see the code and people signing up to the code as really signing up to that obligation of accountability, because you have to be compliant when you start, when you complete your provisional steps, and you also have to comply when you do your self-assessment at the end of every year. So we're very excited as an independent panel to be in this position. We haven't yet had to actually deal with any complaints, and it would be probably, we wouldn't necessarily expect to do that in the infancy of this process, but we're really looking forward to it. And we're here to support those villages that have actually signed up. The residents in those villages say, we're here to assist, we're here to make fair and equal arrangements and decisions. And we're here also, and why we're here today is to also encourage anybody who's thinking about becoming code signatory to do that. So thank you, Ben.
Thanks, Elizabeth. And just a reminder for those of you who might have a question to ask, you can select the Q&A function on the right side of your screen. It's a little voice bubble with a question mark. You can type your question in the compose box and then send it to us. We will compile those questions, and in our Q&A session after our speakers, we will attempt to answer as many of those as we can. So please don't hesitate to ask questions and keep them coming. We've already got quite a few coming through on the system. Our next presenter is the Reverend Alistair Christie, and Alistair is the President of the Australian Retirement Village Residents Association and also President of the ACT Retirement Village Residents Association. Alistair, in his spare time, is a retired minister of the Uniting Church in Australia who still preaches in the Canberra region and has lived in a retirement village for 17 years. Alistair is chair of his resident committee and has been a very strong contributor through the Residents Association to ensuring that industry hears the view of residents, listens to the view of residents, and works very closely with his colleagues in residents associations around the country to ensure that industry is held accountable and that important initiatives like the Code of Conduct really do reflect a strong balance between operators and residents' rights. Alistair is the resident representative on the Code Review Panel and works with Elizabeth in the role of ensuring transparency with the code and ensuring that the processes around the administration of the code are fair and equitable. Over to you, Alistair.
Thank you, Ben. And good morning, everyone. Thank you for taking time to join in this webinar. You heard a little about me from Ben and my background in the last 18 years. My home has been in 2 different retirement villages, one in Sydney and one in Canberra. In the first 5 years, I was doing a great deal of travelling across New South Wales and the ACT, and in that time I was not involved in the life of the village in which I lived. Since then, I've been involved in retirement village resident bodies in the village, in the ACT and nationally, as I responded to join conversation amongst retirement village residents or with operators. In the latter part of 2014, I attended the National Retirement Living Summit in Sydney. There were village residents from Queensland, New South Wales, Victoria, South Australia, Western Australia and the ACT. I was told by one of the representatives from one of the states, quote, "We need to appoint a new national committee. We have someone volunteering to be the Secretary Treasurer. I will be Vice President, and we think you should be the President because you live in Canberra." I still cannot understand the logic of that statement. However, what that person went on to say, there have been 2 opportunities for representatives of the retirement villages to meet with government this year, and no one has been able to attend to represent us. So we think you should be the President. One thing that I have become very conscious of is that residents and operators enter a relationship when contracts are signed. We are in this together, either as resident or operator. In this together is not my phrase, it was the phrase I used, but we've heard that in a very different way a great deal this year, as across the country we are involved together in working to bring COVID under control. Twice in recent years, I've accepted an invitation to join a judging panel for the individual awards presented each year, originally it was Manager of the Year. Now it's widened to cover other roles. Those were inspiring conversations with people in leadership roles across a wide age range. When work began on what has become the Code of Conduct that Megan and Elizabeth and Ben have talked about today, I was asked to comment on the first working document and subsequent drafts. Many people asked questions, made comments, suggested alterations as we were invited along the way. When asked for a comment as the final draft was released, I said I was pleased to see the document in the public arena. Then my phone and email box, my phone rang a deal, my email box filled up with short, sharp calls or emails to tell me I had no right to speak on behalf of them or the retirement villages in their state or nationally. I replied, I was just saying I was pleased to see that it was available for people to comment on, and they did. I was pleased to see and to hear again today that the code has been accepted by a wide range of operators in the industry, and I'm glad to know that people are signing up. Earlier this week, I had a call from a long-time friend, now living in Queensland, who told me someone in their management had given them a copy of the notice about today's event. It was good to catch up with my friend, but I was able to send a link to the code online. I hope other operators, managers, might have done the same thing, encouraging some of you to join in. When invited, I appreciate the opportunity to be a member of the review panel representing residents in this initial stage of the code's life. Some people in the Property Council, in the Retirement Living Council particularly, are conscious that over the years I have continually said, where do the residents fit in this? What part do we have in this? So I'm pleased that the printed words will take on life. If you've not seen a copy of the document, this is the document that was printed, but it's available on downloadable versions, as you have heard. The panel is a small group, which from my point of view is working well with Elizabeth and Megan to guide us along the way. Our work has begun, and from my experience, it will be working hard and long to help shape the industry in a better way. Thank you.
Thanks, Alistair, and thank you again for the contribution you make on behalf of residents. It's now time for our question and answer session, and a reminder, if you have a question, to please submit that so that we can try and answer that for you here during this panel session. If we aren't able to get to your question, we'll respond to you directly and follow up with you offline, but we'll try and get through as many as we can right now. My first question is to Megan as the Code Administrator. Can you tell us what the process is for a village signing up to the code?
Thanks, Ben. It is actually quite a simple process, and I've noticed quite a few questions are coming up there saying about it being voluntary. So again, I have to reiterate, it is voluntary, but if you're with an operator who wants to voluntarily sign up, commit to these practices and pay the fees, then you know you're on a pretty good wicket. So what they will do is they will contact me or go straight to our website. They will complete a questionnaire that asks questions that go through the 3 stages of being in a community. That is moving into, living in and leaving a community. So there's different sections to their code requirements. So they will answer questions to that. And again, I acknowledge questions that are coming through. It is a self-assessment because it is a voluntary code, and I do not go, clearly in this time, I do not go around to villages checking that what they're telling me is true, but that's where the residents also come in. If they read the code and they think their operator isn't doing the right thing, then they let me know and we go from there with regards to possible breaches, sanctions, or maybe just communicating and clarifying any issues. So they will apply online. I'll get the information that they have self-assessed, and then I will set them up in the system, and they will then nominate a code compliance officer, and you're hearing that word a lot. This is one person in the organisation who is my contact. So from there, they'll get their resource, they'll pay their invoice, and then they'll get their resources, including certificates, stickers that they can proudly present, and they are given resources to communicate to the residents that they are code compliant and what that means. So I think at the moment, again, voluntary, yes, it is a self-assessment, but there is another step, and we'll answer that one, talk about the next steps shortly. Thanks, Ben.
Thank you, Megan. Elizabeth, your role as the chair of the Code Review Panel is, as you explained, to provide oversight and direction to the Code Administrator. We've got a question here about wanting to know how genuine the code is in terms of it being at arm's length. And indeed, we also have an industry accreditation scheme, and I might get Megan to talk a little bit about that in a moment. But Elizabeth, is the code at arm's length from industry?
It certainly is, and I must agree with whoever asked the question that is a very sensible and pertinent question to ask. And one, Ben, you'll recall that I spent a lot of time investigating with you and members of the Property Council before I was willing to take up the role. And I've been delighted with the appointment of the panel members and alternates, including Alistair, which I believe does demonstrate that real commitment to independence. And in technical legal terms, it's also independent of Property Council or LASA. Indeed, operators can become signatories to the code irrespective of whether they're members of those peak bodies or not. And I think that's an important feature as well. The really key aspect of this will be as complaints are received and we can really show that independence in action. The interesting thing is, as the panel has been working through some questions that we've been asked about how the code works, that at the moment the panel has been of one mind about the seriousness of the obligations and the scope of those obligations. So at the moment there is no diversity in terms of dispute among panel members about where they think the right answers lie. But that's why we have a three-person panel and reflective of different interest groups. So yes, I am quite confident that we are an independent panel.
Thanks, Elizabeth. And Megan, can you add a little bit to that about the accreditation scheme and perhaps also talk about how there is an independent audit process then for the code for those villages that are signing up to the accreditation scheme?
Thanks, Ben. Yes, the next step, so I keep saying it and I'm sorry to keep reiterating, but it is voluntary and it is self-assessment. However, there is a next step in accreditation called the Australian Retirement Village Accreditation Scheme Standards, or RVAS for short. It's been outsourced to a company called Quality Innovation Performance, and they have a set of 7 standards that are to be met for in regard to community management, human resource management, resident entry and exit, engagement and feedback, community environment, services, facilities, safety and security, and of course, resident care. So what happens is the next step to get RVAS, you must have BEARS code compliant. So it is a very important part of the next step. And then in RVAS, they are independently audited. I believe they're called surveyors in this situation, but they do go out to your community, so, and to all the villages. And it's not a litmus test, it is visiting every single village who wants to sign up, which then does a check that they are code compliant, and then they get to move on to the RVAS stage. And I believe there's apparently approximately 71 villages undergoing RVAS at the moment. So that's also encouraging because it is acknowledging a lengthy process. Again, it is not government mandated, which is why we are continuing to work with governments and show the success of this scheme, even in this infancy, to have it move in that direction. Thanks, Ben.
Thanks, Megan. And building on that response, Elizabeth, we've got a question here that goes into some detail about the self-assessment process and the merits of that, and obviously a concern about whether operators will tell or provide the right information during that. This is where, importantly, the code review panel comes in. Can you talk a little bit about the self-assessment process and how that's viewed by your panel?
Yes, I can. The panel is very much hoping that we will have residents acting and families really also understanding that they're part of the way the code will succeed. And in essence, the way the code's set up is that the emphasis and effort in terms of seeing whether there are problems comes from complaints. And once the complaint is received, and if there is a genuine problem that Megan can identify, then we can go into action in terms of getting that fixed up. What we're really intent on is to have as many villages under the ambit of the code as possible, realising that villages can range from 3 or 4 independent living units through to the largest and most elaborate and most luxurious retirement villages covering numbers of people. And so instead of chewing up money in terms of auditing each and every village that's a signatory, the real engine room of shining a light on a particular village where there are concerns is the complaint. And I think that in a situation where the code is getting off the ground, that's a very sensible kind of way to distribute resources and to make sure that where the concerns are real, then we take a look at them. Thanks, Ben.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Megan, can you recap what the key components of the code are for operators and for residents, what the code specifically focuses on?
Thanks, Ben. It is really quite simple. There are 3 elements to it: moving into, living in, and leaving a community. That's the focus that we found is the most important. So moving into will cover things like the actions of the sales team, the communication, the contracts, that you understand absolutely and transparently what is required of you as the resident and what is being offered by the operator. It is one of the biggest reasons I think that people realised and operators realised that there was a need for this code. We all have a story to tell about a sales experience, so and I'm not denigrating sales managers at all, but there can definitely be miscommunication. And then we move into the living in the community, where certain facilities or offerings may not be meeting your expectations. So and it's very important at this point for me to point out, we do not deal with resident to resident complaints or disputes, that is to be done at a separate entity, whether it's the village management would most likely have a opportunity for a complaints handling process of that type. So our code doesn't deal with that. We deal with operators and residents and those stages. And of course, the final stage is leaving the community. And that can be a really difficult experience. And again, the most important aspect is transparency, especially in regard to contracts. We've found certainly no complaints to this point, but certainly conversations where children and estates may not have been involved originally when the parents or parent moved in, and there is some confusion around exit fees, entitlements, and it really does get a difficult time for everyone involved, and it can be quite an emotive time. So if an operator has clear and concise and transparent interactions, then we shouldn't have a problem, and that's what the code aims to do. Thanks, Ben.
Thanks, Megan. Alistair, if I can go to you now and give you a moment to unmute while I ask the question. You, on behalf of residents and through the Residents Association, have dealt with complaints and concerns that residents have raised over many years. How do you think the code will supplement that and support that? And how willing do you think operators are who've signed up to the code to address the issues that are raised regarding complaints to the code?
Thank you, Ben. It's at this point it's difficult for me to assess that, but I believe that the code will make a difference. Quite frequently in the past, I'm conscious that the operators have been the ones who have had to deal with the complaints, and the experience across Australia, and this is something that actually fed into the initiative, to whether you're aware of that and whether a lot of people in the Property Council, Retirement Living Council, are aware of that. This was one of the issues that when we started having conversations with the Retirement Living Council and the residents, a little before your time, Ben, that was, but I'm glad that it started. And the difficulty of where do you go to next when some operators were not willing to engage. They made decisions and said, this is how it is. So who do you go to next? And that prompted some further conversations within the Retirement Living Council, and it initiated some of the discussions that have led to the development of the code. I know that in some of the state bodies, there have been people who've concentrated on complaints, but I now know that in one of those associations, there's been a decision to concentrate less on one person concentrating on that, to have less concentration, because the code has begun to be understood for the value it is, the instrument that it is, and the possibility of the decision making being taken in another way. I hope that's helpful.
Thanks, Alistair. That's very helpful. I've got a question here for you, Elizabeth, around reporting on activities from your panel and whether there's going to be regular reporting and transparency of the consideration and decisions made.
Yes, thanks, Ben. The obligation of the independent panel is to report annually, and we would be reporting to the independent board, which has established us and appointed us. And the experience of different code schemes for different industries, like the banking code of practice and the insurance code of practice, is that usually the panel in those circumstances takes the opportunity of that reporting to not only describe its work and what's happened, but also to make suggestions back to the independent board, or indeed even out to the public, about improvements it thinks would be beneficial. And I imagine we'll do the same. We just need to be clear that the actual obligations under the code are not something the independent panel can change of itself. It needs to make recommendations if it thinks there's stuff missing from the code or things that need to change in the code. And generally speaking, it would usually make those recommendations based, again, on the complaints and the actual lived experience of what it sees. So, again, another reason to be very hopeful that we would get people actually making genuine complaints to us if they can't resolve things at the village level, because that's the way that we shine a light on what isn't working. Separately, the question might have in mind, can people see exactly who's been involved in code breaches and exactly what's happened? And the answer is that there are, at the moment the code is constructed, it's only if there are major repeat breaches that there's in effect a naming and shaming arrangement. So obviously the people involved at the village who are actually made the complaint will know how things are being resolved, but there is no, at the moment, major naming and shaming power in the panel. Can I just say, Ben, if you don't mind, that it's important to remember that what we're describing here is that the code is a safety net, it's a major first step, it's not law. And so there are various laws in various states that deal with all sorts of issues in retirement villages thought to require the legislative response, the naming and shaming, the penalties. So there's the law, then there's this code as a safety net. And what Megan's describing as the accreditation scheme is, if you like, the icing on the cake. It's a very important and valuable asset if you're an actually accredited village, but it requires a huge investment of time and money. And as we described before, villages come in all shapes and sizes. So accreditation won't be for everybody, but the code will be for everybody. That's the point.
Yeah.
Thanks, Elizabeth. We've had a few questions about the specific difference between the code of conduct and accreditation. I might just quickly address that in a very simple way, to say that the code is very much about a resident-facing response. It's all about the way that a village interprets the legislation and the way that it builds its relationship with residents and the information and support provided to residents. Accreditation is about the quality systems or the processes that sit behind that. So accreditation is about operators ensuring that they have the right systems and processes in place to deliver on the code all the time and every time. So it's an enhancement. It's about ensuring that the village runs properly, runs smoothly, and is doing what it needs to do to meet all of its legislative and contractual obligations. So they both serve a very different purpose, but to get accreditation, the village first has to be compliant with the code. When a village then becomes accredited, as Megan said, the code compliance is then independently audited by a third party. Megan, can you answer the question about what it costs to sign up to the code?
Yes, thanks, Ben. So it costs, if you're a member of LASER or the Property Council of Australia, there is an acknowledgement of your membership and the support you have given to the start of the code. So the cost is $200 per village, $2.50 per ILU, and an initial application of $100 per village. And that's just a one-off. If you are not a member of either organisation, it is $500 per village, $6.25 per ILU, and $250 as the one-off application fee. And I've noticed there were some questions on RVAS fees. That is actually determined by QIP, and they work with operators on a scheme of the size of the operation, really, how many villages, just like us, how many villages, how many ILUs, and they have a set schedule of fees, but they work directly with the operator in that regard. And I've also noticed some questions about who pays for it. So it really depends on the setup of your village. I issue the invoice to the operator is the best way I can answer that. And then between the Residents Association and the operators, that's another conversation. So I hope that answers everyone's questions that are flying through there about the cost of it. Thank you.
Thanks, Megan. Elizabeth, we've had a couple of questions about how the code relates to legislation, particularly a question here about the difference between the Retirement Village Act in Victoria and the code, and also the changes that were in New South Wales, I think last year, and how the code relates to what government is putting into legislation around the country.
Yes, so law is always law, and if there is a law in any state that mandates a particular notice or a particular time frame or a set of obligations, then those laws have to be complied with. And that includes if there are different laws relating to strata title rights and responsibilities. So this code, it's a voluntary code. It's a best practice code. It has to always give way to the actual law, and so that's why I think it's really valuable to see the code. And as it evolves, this will become more important. Even still, the general provisions, the values and principles, which are set out in the first few pages under the heading commitments. So the way the code's written, it isn't written in a way that it is a law in a sort of black letter type law way. You shall do this, you shall do that. It's about values and principles and standards, and that's the way it is. So the state legislature will always be the beginning and the end, and this, if you like, is the first overlay over the top. And then over the top of that again is if a village is accredited. So it's a bit like you might have a law about food handling and food standards in a cafe, and then the cafe may also be part of the best bagel production code, which will tell you what a best bagel looks like. And then on top of that, the particular food service place might have an actual agreement with its franchise holder that it will measure things out in a certain way, and it will always have audited lists of everything that happens and all the ingredients that go in. And that's like a kind of three-tier system that I'm describing here.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Megan, who appoints the Code Compliance Officer?
Thanks, Ben. The Code Compliance Officer is appointed by the operator, and I can tell you they are many and varied roles. Predominantly, it's either the CEO or a quality improvement manager, someone with experience in dispute management, complaints handling, and because that is my one contact. We try to avoid village managers being appointed, as that is where conflict may arise.
Yes.
But we also understand that in smaller operations, of course, that can't be avoided, and the village manager is very open with residents that whilst they are the code compliance officer, the resident has every right to detour them and come straight to me as a code administrator if they have a complaint that they don't want to raise or don't feel has been adequately resolved. So they're many and varied, Ben, but it is indeed up to the operator, and they can change as the code progresses and they see where there is a need for someone maybe with more experience or relevance to work in that role. So hopefully pretty soon everyone who's in a code compliant village will know who their code compliance officer is. It's unlikely to be someone within the immediate community, someone again with the relevant experience somewhere in the organisation, and that is my one contact. And another reason why we believe the code will work to expedite complaints and dispute resolution, because it's not directly at the coalface, but someone maybe more senior who can grasp it, and then we can all work together to get it resolved, whatever the issue may be. Thanks, Ben.
Thanks, Megan. And we only unfortunately have time for one more question before we have to wrap up this morning. We have quite a few questions that we haven't been able to get to, but we will attempt to answer those questions with you directly. I'm going to throw this question first to Alistair and then to Elizabeth to call on her many years as a regulator to give her thoughts. But Alistair, what would your advice be to residents who are struggling to get their operator to sign up to the code? Would you think that there's a pathway that they might be able to pursue?
Some of the residents in the ACT have told me that we don't need the code because it's covered, disputes are covered by the ACT legislation. But we have to begin somewhere, Ben. And I know in the village that I live in, the appointed dispute officer for under whatever name that might be is the person who is the chief operations officer of the village, i.e. a general manager. And I'm uncomfortable about that. I can't keep pushing that, but I think that there's been an interest in becoming a code compliant village, so that that might bring relief from me. There are some people who will say, well, the best thing to do is to go to ACAT, which is known under various names in the States, and that can be, it's a long process, and for people who are residents in villages, their age and their experience is not necessarily up to coping with going to the ACAT. That's not going to be a real answer to your question, but that's some observation, personal observation, Ben. Thank you.
Thanks, Alistair. And Elizabeth, to you for the last word. Do you have any advice for residents who see an interest in their village signing up to the code but are struggling to get traction with their operator?
Well, I've been a consumer advocate and a consumer protection person for a long time. So I think this is not a government response, Ben, but a consumer response. In the end, the reputation of the village and the word of mouth of residents to incoming residents matters hugely to operators. And I think that as more and more people sign up to the code and it's regarded as valuable, then retirement villages that do not have are not code signatories are not going to be as desirable a place. So I think it's about residents making it clear to operators that this is about the saleability and the reputation of the village, and that it's what they're going to say to their friends and neighbours when they're thinking of moving in. It's a kind of like consumer power here. And I suppose from our side, the independent panel, that is, what we also want to do separately is to continue with dialogue with operators collectively and individually to convince them that there's nothing to be feared in this. In fact, this is a great selling point. This is a great way, actually, I think, of reducing disputes and complaints. I mean, if a operator was genuinely wholly compliant with the code, the transparency and accountability that are offered should deal with almost everything that is going to arise and provide a way forward about what should be done. And that's the magic of the code, is it's intended to be prospective, to stop problems before they start, by really, as Alistair really like his emphasis on relationships, by setting the relationship in the right context and letting everybody know what they can expect of each other. Thanks, Ben.
Thanks, Elizabeth. And I can certainly say on behalf of the members of the Retirement Living Council, and I know that our friends at Laser say the same, that if operators aren't prepared to sign up, why won't they make that commitment to you? And we are certainly very strongly of the view that a resident looking to move into a village should ask and think twice before going into a village that hasn't signed up to the code. It's an important commitment to residents. It's a demonstration that the operator is committed to you. Yes, there's a lot more that the industry can do, and we're always committed to improving and trying to enhance the experience of living in a retirement community. And that's why we see our relationship with residents as extraordinarily important. And it's why we as an industry group work so closely with people like Alistair and the presidents of the residents associations around the country who are representing your concerns, your needs, your desires and your interests to make sure that we're really moving forward together and not having to rely on government to take months, if not years, to sort out issues, that we can work to get ahead of those problems and deal with them as a industry that works together, that respects its customers and very much values the responsibility that we have in the community to provide safe and secure homes for so many Australians. I thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. As I said earlier, if we didn't get to your question, we'll certainly deal with that offline. If you do have a follow-up question, please reach out and speak to us and we will endeavour to answer that for you. If you want to get a copy of the code, you can visit our website, www.awisemove.com.au. That website lists all the villages around the country that have signed up to the code. It includes a lot of information about the code and will be the place where we provide reports and further information on the progress of the code as we move forward. A huge thank you to our speakers today, Megan Hobson, the Code Administrator, Dr. Elizabeth Lanyon, the Independent Chair of the Code Review Panel, and Alistair Christie, the Resident Representative on the Code Review Panel. One of the questions that we didn't get to was a question about how do people get on the Code Review Panel? Well, there are 3 representatives, the Independent Chair, the Resident Rep, and there is an Operator Rep. At the expiration of the terms for all of those people, we will be reaching out and calling for nominations. And we hope that there is a lot of interest in working with us to make the code better, to make the code very effective, and to ensure that it makes your experience in a retirement village even better. Thank you again. If you want to see a recording of this, or if you have friends in your village who weren't able to join us today, a recording will be emailed out to you next week. and certainly any other information that you want is only an email away. I look forward to staying in touch with you. Thank you.